Let me get started with the introduction. Others will be joining as I roll through the standard text and then get into today's session. I'm thoroughly delighted that so many people are here today. I believe we've achieved a recent high attendance. It's a wonderful compliment to our speaker. Thanks for coming. I'm Norm Sondheimer, the chair of the Israeli Task Force of the Jewish Community Relations Council of the Committee of the Federation in Greater Hartford. As you know, the JCRC is a public affairs voice of the Federation. We educate, advocate, and mobilize for Israel in many different ways and with many different partners. Today's briefing is such an example of the JCRC's programs. We're here to honor a tradition going back to Franklin Roosevelt that the first 100 days of a new American president's term is a milestone that allows us to evaluate their goals. With the election of Joe Biden as president, the JCRC decided to invite back our favorite expert on the situation in the Middle East, Avi Melamed, who asked us to explain how the change, we asked him to explain how the change of US presidency is affecting the Middle East, and as he does so incredibly well, project the future. For those who haven't followed Avi, he's an Israeli author, educator, and independent Middle Eastern strategic intelligence analyst. He's a former senior official on Arab affairs and an Israeli intelligence officer. His 2016 book is Inside the Middle East, Making Sense of the Most Dangerous and Complicated Region on Earth. He has a new book coming out soon. He has been physically and virtually with us many times. We hope to have him here physically on his book tour. Now, there are too many people here for Avi to see you have a question to ask, and I know you will have many questions. Please put them in the Q&A box. You can see it at the bottom of your screen. I'll get them to Avi. My apologies in advance if we don't get to every question. And my assumption is that I will need to combine questions to get as many topics in as possible. So thank you for your patience. Thank you again for joining us, and I'm pleased to turn this over to Avi.
Norm, thank you so much for your kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, shalom from Israel. As always, I'm very honored and thankful for the stage I've been given. And as always, I'm looking forward to our meetings and sessions. Tonight, we are going to discuss the new administration in the United States and the Middle East. But I want to be more specific and clear about it. In my presentation tonight, what I would try to do is to reflect to you the best way I can professionally, of course, in a most objective way, how the regional factors are looking at Biden's administration policy vis-a-vis the Middle East. I want to make it very clear that in my presentation, I'm not going to provide grades for the Biden administration performances. This is not my job. I rather would like very much to share with you the perspectives from the region and maybe, hopefully, to share with you some observations that are my own professional observation and, of course, reflects my own opinion. So when Biden is entering his position in January 2020, he is meeting a steaming Middle East that is going through an enormous reshape of its geostrategic landscape. We are looking at a region that is now shaped by some major powers that are reshaping the whole structure of the region and the whole geostrategical landscape. We are looking at balance of power between different regional powers and factors in the region. Shortly, I will say something about that. We are looking at a struggle for a new model of statehood across the Arab world. We are looking at a time where the Western hegemony in the Middle East actually comes to an end, and we are viewing the early days, the dawn of what I call the beginning of the era of Pax China. So when I'm talking about balance of power between different regional factors, let me, for example, share with you one of the most, if not currently the most significant power struggle that stems from the hegemonic vision and the aggression regional policy of the Mullah regime in Tehran, rather known as the Shiite or the Iranian crescent. When you look at the map, you could see the shape of this crescent. The Mullah regime is enhancing a very aggressive regional policy, combining armies of terror deployed in different parts of the region, advancing and developing its missiles capacities, its attacking drones capacities, developing its nuclear capacities. The bottom line, one of the major uh, powers or issues that today shapes the feature of the region is this Iranian aggression across the Middle East, from the Mediterranean shore, Gaza Strip, crossing through Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Bahrain, down all the way down to the Arab Gulf, the Persian Gulf, the Arab Sea, Yemen, Bab el-Mandab Strait, and the Red Sea entering Africa. So when you look at the map from that perspective, you could see the deployment of these armies of terror that the Mullah regime has deployed and activates across the region. Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza Strip, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Shiite Afghans, Iraqi Shiite militias, Pakistani Shiite militias, Houthi Shiites in Yemen, all are part of this armies of terrorists / agents and proxies that the Iranians are using in the region to further enhance their hegemonic vision. But that's not the whole picture, of course. Another major regional power, Turkey, is also leading a very aggressive regional policy, trying to enhance a vision of reviving the glorious days of the Turkish Ottoman Empire. Looking at the map of the Middle East, you could see the Turkish flag almost everywhere across the Middle East, deep into Africa and Western Africa. Like the Iranian regime, the Turks are also leading a very aggressive regional policy aims to serve this vision of reviving the Turkish Ottoman Empire's days. So these are two major powers that, as you could understand, already shakes and shapes the features and the characteristics and the geostrategic landscape of the region. Adding to that is what I mentioned before, the power struggle in Arab states, as Arab states are actually entering an era where the struggle over their path, identity, and direction is further escalating and intensifying. All across the region in the Middle East, you could see Arab states like Tunisia, Algeria, Jordan, and others that are engulfed with this power struggle trying to define their path ahead. You could see other Arab states that are already sinking in chaos, like Libya, Lebanon, Yemen, Syria. Major Arab state like Egypt that is struggling enormously huge challenges. All in all, when you look at the picture of the statehood in the Middle East, across the region, the Arab worlds, the Arab countries, time and again, you could see that this struggle over path, identity, and direction is yet another volcanic power that shapes the features of the Middle East. In those circumstances, we are also witnessing the emergence of a very unique, unprecedented coalition, which I call the Alliance of Moderation. You can see the flags, and in the middle you could see a familiar flag, the flag of Israel. This is a coalition of Arab states, mostly Arab Gulf monarchies, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain. In the backstage, quietly but yet actively involved, is also the most significant Arab Gulf monarchy, Saudi Arabia. And other Arab states, Egypt, Jordan, to a lesser extent, Sudan and Morocco, they are all part of this alliance of moderation. an axis, an alliance that basically emerged, and to a large extent, the background of the emergence of that alliance is the backdrop, is the counter reaction to the previous factors that I have described earlier, meaning the Turkish and the Iranian hegemonic vision, the struggle over path, identity, and direction in the Arab world. These are the major factors that in the end of the day resulted in, as a counter reaction, the emergence of the alliance of the moderation in the Middle East, a very significant alliance. And as you could see, one of the most significant aspects of that alliance is that Israel is viewed as a very significant strategic partner for the members of this alliance. Adding to that, we are now witnessing the emergence of the giant that is coming from the East, China. China is in the Middle East, like many other places in the globe, and China is deepening its presence, involvement, and accordingly, obviously, its influence in the Middle East. Guided by the vision of one belt, one road, China is focusing lots of efforts in the Middle East. We just had a recent example with the Chinese-Iranian strategic agreement signed for 25 years. China imports almost half of its oil needs from the Middle East. China's major maritime routes cross through the Middle East, the Arab or the Persian Gulf, the Indian Ocean connecting to the Arab Sea and leading to the Red Sea and up through the Suez Canal to the Mediterranean. The Middle East is enormously significant for China in any perspective, whether with or without the one belt, one road vision. It is no wonder then that when you look at the map of the Middle East right now, given to what I say, you see this complex picture. You see the flags of Turkey that stands for the Turkish hegemonic vision, we talked about it. You see the Iranian flag scatters in different parts of the region, representing the Iranian crescent Shiite hegemonic vision. And you see the flags that stands for the alliance of moderation, and how all this system is now engaged in a very delicate, tricky, dangerous power struggle, trying to create an equilibrium in a very fragile reality and in a very sensitive circumstances. This is the Middle East that Biden administration is facing when he enters the position in January 2021. And if that is not enough, now it's about time to make some observation, which I think is maybe the most significant observation regarding the policy of Biden administration generally, and particularly vis-a-vis the reality of the Middle East. And the characteristic I'm talking about is what I refer to as the duality or inner tension between two major forces that underlines the Biden's policy. The realpolitik on the one hand, and the idealpolitik on the other hand. The realpolitik is the traditional classic policy that is based on practical interests, achieving your interests, whether security-wise, economically-wise, trade, and so on and so on. Idealpolitik is a policy that endorsed and praised and even prioritized moral and ideological concepts that actually are driven by the belief that Western ideals and values that are at the core of Western mindset, philosophy, political system, cultural system, like civil rights, equality, freedom of speech, and on, should and can and should be achieved through actions and policies. This is, in my view, the major characteristic of the Biden's administration policy. And that has a lot of ramifications when you look particularly in the context of the situation or the policy vis-a-vis the Middle East. Day one to Biden's administration, the Middle East factors are looking at the new administration, and the code word, the title, I would say, is they are looking and they are wondering. Lots of questions. What will be Biden's policy towards Iran and Turkey's hegemonic ambitions? What weight will Idealpolitik play in Biden policy? Will Biden partially or fully adopt President Trump's Middle East policy and legacy, meaning the Abraham Accords, the Peace to Prosperity plan that Trump administration envisioned as a solution for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Time and again in the early days and following the early days, and actually up until now, I can tell you that many Arab commentators sum up those questions to one interesting phrase saying, will Biden be Obama number 2? And let me just explain it very shortly. When Arab commentators are making the comparison between Biden and Obama, this is a significant expression of concern. Because across the Middle East, in the Arab world, and also in Israel, the bottom line is that Obama's administration is viewed as a very bad administration to the interests of the Arab world, and to a lesser extent, an administration that also was very harmful in context of Israel's strategic interest. So when Arab commentators, and many of them, are making those questions in day one of Biden's administration, that question, I can quote you endless articles. Is Biden Obama, that question times and again appears in the perspectives that are reflected by different factors in the Arab world. So day one, Biden's administration, the key word in the Middle East is wondering, asking questions, puzzled. What will be Biden's administration policy vis-a-vis the region? We are now day 100. And once again, if I need to sum up, to crystallize the perspectives from the region, I would say in one word, unclear. In other words, regional factors are looking at Biden's policy in day 100. And the major characteristic of their perspective is one that expresses it is unclear what exactly Biden's policy is. Where is he heading to? That sense of unclearness, I would even say to a certain extent confusion, that is being reflected by different regional factors vis-a-vis Biden's policy, stems from a couple of reasons that has to do with the policy itself. One reason is the seemingly what seems to be like now a zigzagging policy of Biden's administration towards the Iranian aggression. Other reason is what seems to be a flexible implementation of Idealpolitik, a selective one, if you wish. Another issue is, for example, that up until now, 100 days to its rule, Biden administration, relatively speaking, almost is uninvolved or unpresent in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It is very clear, as of now, that the Israeli-Palestinian issue is down prioritized in the agenda of Biden's administration. These examples and others are basically fueling this sense of confusion, uncertainty among different regional factors. Let me start with the issue of the zigzagging policy towards Iran. So right now there are talks in Vienna, and there are all kinds of rumors / reports / statements that increases the confusion. Because on the one hand, seemingly, Biden administration, according to some report, is full steam ahead towards going back to the JCPOA, the agreement that was signed in 2015 by Barack Obama's administration and the Iranians. Yet at the other hand, Biden administration time and again emphasized that he is aware of the fact that there has been some very significant flaws in the JCPOA that has to be addressed. Biden administration's time and again emphasized that he is aware of the concerns of his allies in the region, like Israel, like Saudi Arabia, who are saying, and rightfully so, saying, look, it's not only about the Iranian nuclear issue, it's about the Iranian armies of terror. It's about the Iranian missiles and ballistic missiles program. It's about the Iranian attack drones. These are all issues that the Biden administrations validate as very relevant. Yet at the same time, there are reports or statements that could be interpreted as if Biden administration is rushing. I can tell you that some commentators in the Arab world are saying Biden administration is eager to sign a deal with the Iranians, and they provide all kinds of explanations for that. So here, for itself, you can already see there is a sense of uncertainty and confusion that is very much expressed by different factors in the region, by the way, including in Israel. There is another example for this duality that also confuses many factors in the region, and that is the way Biden administration addresses the aggression of the Iranian proxies in the region. And what we see is a policy that has a duality. It's a policy that on the one hand is confronting that aggression, but on the other hand, it is containing the aggression. I'll give you one example for a policy that addresses the same challenge in the same place in two ways, both confronting but also containing. And I'm talking about Iraq. There has been numerous attacks of Iranian-backed Iraqi Shiite militias on US facilities in Iraq, on bases in Iraq that harbors US military forces, on civil projects where American citizens are working in Iraq for infrastructure purposes and stuff like that. There has been one case that following shooting of rockets resulting in the injury of American personnel in Iraq, Biden administration responded with using military might. In February 21, Biden administration attacks the Imam Ali Iranian military compound located in the eastern part of Syria. You could see the arrow pointing at this place. This is a military compound established by the Iranians, and it's a very significant element in the Iranian land corridor stretching from Iraq through Syria to Lebanon. Iranians, militants, weapons, ammunitions streams through that compound on the way to Syria. Biden administration attacked that compound, almost totally wiping it off, the face of Earth. Yet, since then, there has been many attacks of rockets and missiles in Iraq targeting American forces or facilities, yet those attacks have been unanswered. So you could see this is something that fuels confusion among different regional factors. Another example, this time from the other end, meaning containing, is the story of the war in Yemen. Very short background. In September 2014, Houthi tribes in Yemen, Shiites, about 35% of the population in Yemen, mostly located in the northern part of Yemen. Houthis in Yemen are launching a coup and they are ousting a legitimate Yemenite government. The Houthis, massively supported by the Iranians, armed by the Iranians, provided with military know-how and so on by the Iranians, are spreading their presence in Yemen, threatening actually to take over Yemen. This is alarming the Saudis because they understand that actually what they are facing is an Iranian army in the shape of the Houthis that is now going to border Saudi Arabia from the south and present Saudi Arabia with a very significant threat. Time will show that the Saudi concern was totally justified. So after almost 6 months of attempts to find a political solution, that the Saudis were leading those attempts, the attempts failed. In March 2015, the Saudis are leading a military coalition, including the United Arab Emirates and other Arab forces, in order to stop the expansion of the Houthis in Yemen and actually to call all the sides back to the table in order to find a political solution. That's roughly speaking the background of the story of the war in Yemen. The war in Yemen results in inevitably a major humanitarian crisis. So Biden administration focuses very early on the story of the war in Yemen. One of the major reasons Biden administration is focusing so much in the war in Yemen is because there is a very clear fingerprint of the ideal politics in that issue. The humanitarian crisis, the lingering of the war, and reminding you the story of Khashoggi. All those factors are basically fueling the Idealpolitik agenda. And in their turn, Idealpolitik agenda circles are putting pressure on Biden's administration to focus first on the war in Yemen, and particularly in two major aspects. One is to end the war and to end or to put an end to the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. And the other thing is to actually, in a way, sanction the Saudis for what is being viewed by those circles, meaning the Idealpolitik circle, but what being viewed as a Saudi aggression, and reminding you the story of Khashoggi plays very significant role in that context. Under that, I would say, pressure, Biden administration is addressing almost immediately the story of the war in Yemen and is kind of like guided by some couple of guiding lines. End the war, end the humanitarian crisis, ban sales of offensive weapons to Saudi Arabia, pledge to guarantee Saudi defense capacities, and reverse labeling of the Houthis as terror organization, the label that was made by Trump administration. The outcome on the ground is that, unfortunately, it is counterproductive. The war in Yemen further escalates up until now, and accordingly, the humanitarian crisis. When I was talking about the flexible implementation of Idealpolitik, here are a couple of examples. So you take Turkey or Saudi Arabia, two states that are obviously not known to be as a very observant of human rights, political rights, and so forth and so forth. And you could see how Biden administration is applying policy because of the fact that those states are violating human rights, political rights, and so on and so on. For example, Turkey. The first conversation between the US president and the Turkish president took place this Saturday. And the background for that was the American President Biden informed the Turkish president, that he is going to acknowledge and recognize the Armenian Holocaust, the Armenian genocide, which, as you can understand, evoke an enormous uproar in Turkey and an enormous pushback. Saudi Arabia, we just mentioned it, the story of Khashoggi. A report was done and published in the very early days of Biden administration, basically indicting Mohammed bin Salman, but practically applying sanctions on its close circle, some of his bodyguards, members, or personnel. But at the same time, you are looking at other states in the region like Egypt or Iran that, again, are not known for being a strict observant of human rights, political rights, and so forth and so forth. And there is no any kind of form of action of the Biden administration towards those states. In other words, what you're looking at is a flexible implementation of the ideal politics, if you wish, a selective one. And now you can understand how it fuels more confusion and wandering within the regional factors. Another issue that I mentioned was the Israeli-Palestinian arena. The bottom line, as of today, it's very clear that the whole issue is a low priority for the Biden administration. Notice that up until now, there is no US ambassador to Israel. Up until now, Biden has not talked to the Palestinian president Mahmoud Abbas. There is very low level connection or communication between the US and the Palestinian Authority. That being said, along that, Biden administration is restoring funding for the Palestinian Authority. It's restoring funding for the United Nations Relief and Welfare Agency, UNRWA, in Gaza Strip. Reopened the PLO offices in Washington, D.C. But at the same time also, Biden administration is very unsupportive of the upcoming Palestinian elections that are supposed to take place this summer and fall. Once again, an example of a policy that fuels a lot of unclarity. What exactly is the guiding line? The regional factors are asking themselves, where is Biden's administration actually standing? And therefore, when you look at today, 100 days to Biden policy in the Middle East, if you look or screen through the major factors, the regional factors, this is roughly speaking the major sentiments that I can share with you. So I'm starting with the alliance of moderation that I mentioned before. By the way, these are US allies. And there is a lot of lack of clarity about Biden's agenda. And there is a growing concern about Biden's policy towards Iranian aggression, specifically the whole issue of what is Biden going to do exactly with the story of the Iranian armies of terror and missiles program, the nuclear program, of course. More and more I'm coming across recently, more and more Arab commentators that are expressing a growing, I would say, concern that is now also bordering discontent. At this point, it is informal. It's only being expressed in an informal level, but to a large extent, it is expressing the view of some governments and rulers in the region. On the other hand, you look at the Iranians. So the Iranians are now have some sort of a cautious optimism because they believe that Biden administration is getting closer to them, sort of speaking. By the way, this is one of the reasons why the Iranians are toughening their positions in the negotiations. They are under the impression that Biden administration, roughly speaking, in the end of the day, will more or less go back to the JCPOA. Alongside that, the Iranians are still concerned because they remember that Biden administration attacked militarily their compound in eastern Syria. They are also aware of the fact that Biden administration says more than once the issue of the armies of terror and missiles has to be addressed because this is a very significant destabilizing factor. So the Iranians are also looking at the Biden's administration from both sides of the spectrum. Turkey is clearly, I would say, the one and only factor in the region that has no ambiguity, sort of speaking. It's very clear. Turkey is, as of now, in a very hard collision track with the United States, centers different topics. For example, the issue of human rights and political rights in Turkey, the issue of Turkey's and the Kurds, Another example, the story of the Armenian genocide just now, Turkey's aggression and provocation in the eastern basin of the Mediterranean. All those factors and others, as of now, are setting Turkey and the United States on a collision course. This is the only clear factor in the region that you could say very clearly there is no place for misunderstanding. The United States and Turkey right now are not best friends, sort of speaking. Palestinian Authority, on the one hand, they have hopes and expectations. They are basically saying we have been to the worst, meaning as far as the Palestinians are concerned, from their perspective, Trump administration was the worst ever. So now they say it can't get worse and Biden administration is going to be more friendly. But yet again, the Palestinians are looking at the fact that Biden administration actually does not rush to undo major components of Trump's legacy. For example, Biden administration announced that the US embassy will remain in Jerusalem. Biden administration, as I mentioned before, basically clearly right now is downsizing or downgrading the issue of the Palestinians in its political agenda. So the Palestinians are also looking at Biden's Middle East policy and they are also intrigued. They're kind of like not sure exactly to say where Biden's policy is heading to, what's the direction, what's the guiding lines. And to conclude my presentation, I would say that there is a good way to show the differences or to understand better the inclarity of Biden administration when you compare that to what guides China. I mentioned earlier China. I talked about China's growing role in the Middle East. And when you look at the guiding lines of the two different powers, to a large extent, it tells the story. When you look at the Western policy, you are looking at a policy that, as I said before, is navigating all the time between these two poles, ideal politics on the one hand versus real politics, and all the maneuvering that it results, all the needs to do this, what I call belly dancing to a large extent. Western policy is multi-focus. It has different topics, different issues it covers. Therefore, it has different priorities. It is decentralized. There are many players that are involved in the shaping and implementing of Western policy, both governmental and official, as well as non-governmental and non-official, like NGOs, for example. And Western policy is, roughly speaking, leaning towards more and more gradual disengagement. When you look at the Chinese policy guiding line, it is totally the opposite. Ideal politics does not exist in the Chinese agenda or vocabulary. It's all about real politics. While Western policy is multi-focused, the Chinese is singular focused, it's laser focused. It is all about securing China's interest, energy security, food security, trade security, shipping security. Everything is focused, laser focused to that end, to obtain and achieve those ends. Western policy is decentralized, the Chinese one is centralized. While Western policy more and more leaning towards gradual disengagement, China is rapidly increasing and deepening its engagement in the Middle East. So I think it's a good way to conclude and actually really make us understand through that comparison the challenges that Western policy, and particularly Biden's policy right now, because of this inner tension between ideal and real politics, has. Objectively, it's already challenging for itself. And it's more challenging once you are taking into consideration the very complex, multi-layered geostrategic features of the Middle East, as I was presenting in the beginning of my presentation.
Oh, thank you so much, Avi. God, what an incredible presentation. I know it was really unfair of us to ask you to talk 100 days after the administration took over, but it's the tradition. And so it is unclear, but we've got a lot of questions coming in. Let me start with the one area that the Biden administration has put a lot of effort in. I'll read the question as it was submitted, but it's a more general question on the divergence of Israeli-Saudi policy toward Iran and what may well be Biden's policy. Is Biden's looking the other way on on a nuclear Iran, putting it in direct conflict with Israel and Saudi policy that will not tolerate a nuclear armed Iran? That assumes that Biden is looking the other way. But could you comment on the apparent diversion of strategy and how it could be resolved?
Well, I think the only thing that I can say certain for that is that there is a very clear message that comes from Israel, the Saudis, but not only them, other Gulf monarchies, and by the way, other like Egypt, that is kind of like a relatively sort of like in a remote area. And the message is going to Biden administration, as I mentioned before. They are saying to Biden administration, saying, look, the JCPOA was a very bad agreement. It resulted in a growing Iranian aggression. It's leading the Middle East to a growing chaos and instability. And reminding you that the Iranian aggression is based upon three major pillars: the nuclear program, the missile program, the armies of terror that is spreading. These are all issues that has to be addressed. And Biden administration acknowledged that. So one thing that I think is very significant to notice is a statement that was made by the Israeli Prime Minister not so long ago, which he basically said something like, take into consideration, he says, that we are not obliged to an agreement that will be signed by anybody with the Iranians, meaning Israel is not obliged. I think this is a very interesting and significant statement to make. To make a long story short, I would say, look, Iran presents a very significant threat to the region and particularly to the state of Israel. And it's not only about the nuclear capacities. It's about the Iranian deployment of armies and terror, the precise missiles and other things. And that has to be understood. That is why the Israeli Prime Minister, and I believe any other Israeli Prime Minister will not have a different position, say, you can sign whatever you want with the Iranians, but in the end of the day, it's us, Israel, that is in the front line, and we will have to decide what is the right thing for us. I think that message has to be very well here in the West.
And just extending it, is that also true of the Arab states that border Iran or near Iran?
Well, the Arab states that are bordering Iran use the different kind of message. By the way, there are reports recently, there are some kind of talks between the Saudis and the Iranians, which probably may take place. Iraq is kind of like the go-between, the mediator. But here is an interesting statement that was made by the by the Saudi foreign minister, and he repeated that. He said, the moment Iran is going to have a nuclear weapon, Saudi Arabia is going to have a nuclear weapon as well. In other words, this is another sign or another very strong message from the region, this time not from Israel, but from the Arab world, from the Saudis, who are saying openly, they're saying to the West, look, if Iran is going to have a nuclear weapon, we are entering a nuclear armament of the Middle East. Mm-hmm. Yet again, this is a very powerful message that has to be, the bells must be heard in the West.
Let me jump to the part of your talk that is more new than anything we've heard from you, and that's Chinese involvement. There are many questions here. Could you comment on what the Biden administration might do, what we should watch for as that happened? Can you comment on the welcoming that they'll receive given the attitude toward the Uyghurs in Western China that China is apparently evidenced? And perhaps you can comment on other players such as Russia and how this all plays in a geopolitical, worldwide view of what's going to happen.
Yes, well, I'll start with what I said before. We are witnessing the end of the Western hegemony in the Middle East, and we are now witnessing the growing role of China in the Middle East. Russia is also back in the Middle East, reminding you. Russia is back in Syria. Russia is back in the North Africa, in Libya, the eastern basin of the Mediterranean. We are now looking at a region that is not any longer the sole, playground of the Western powers. This is the opening point. China in the Middle East has a lot of aspects, but I would say, to sum it up, I would say something like that. Following what I said about the Chinese very laser-focused policy, China is looking first and foremost for stability. China needs stability in the Middle East. As I mentioned, almost 50% of China's oil is coming from the Middle East. The major trade routes are going through the Middle East. You can understand why China needs stability in the Middle East. In that sense, the laser-focused Chinese policy is good for the Middle East. Because if China slams on the table and says, folks, I need stability, you listen. It's significant. Now, as China is concerned, growing influence in the Middle East is a very significant value for another reason, because it is countering the power struggle with the United States that is evolving and escalating in Southeast Asia. In that sense, I would say again that as long as there is clarity of Western policy vis-a-vis the Middle East, particularly the US policy, it is, I would say, kind of like harming the United States interest. The example, the recent strategic agreement signed between China and Iran. So there are lots of ins and outs, downsides and upsides to the growing presence of China in the Middle East, but this is a fact and it's irreversible. As of for Russia, Russia is also, as I said, back in the Middle East, and Russia is all the time looking for opportunities. The mantra, or the I would say the formula is very simple. There is no vacuum. If there is empty space, somebody is going to try and walk into this space. And once again, I think that when you look at the major characteristic of the Western policy vis-a-vis the Middle East, not only the US, but particularly the US, and particularly given this bipolar realpolitik versus idealpolitik, what you see more and more is there are more and more spaces, empty spaces that are created, sort of speaking, in the region. In other words, it is kind of like an open invitation to China and Russia to deepen its presence in the region.
Mm-hmm.
And down the road, of course, we should also mention India, another significant regional and global power struggle, but India is going to join later on the process.
How will India join the process?
Well, India is, I remind you, it's some 1.2 billion people nation. Like China, lots of needs, lots of capacities, lots of growing abilities in many different ways, militarily, technologically, economically. We are looking at one of the giants of the world. And when you are a giant in the world, you can't stay in your own niche.
Let's switch to a look at the change in policy that may well be evidenced between the Trump administration and the Biden administration. So let's talk about the Abraham Accords first, because the Biden administration has many times expressed positive views. That would involve completion of the, what you might call sweeteners, that the Trump administration gave to Morocco, to Sudan, to the UAE, to join in the accords. And it would involve, secondly, an estimate, in your opinion, of where we could look as a signpost as the next country to join the accords, what it might be and what would be reasonable for us to watch for Biden administration?
Yes, no, generally speaking, I would say Biden administration is definitely continuing the path of Trump administration in that sense, in that context of the alliance of moderation, and rightfully so. The alliance of moderation is a very significant positive asset as far as the United States of America is concerned, and as far as the region is concerned. And therefore, by the way, there was an interesting example of how, in that specific context, realpolitik was more dominant than the idealpolitik, and rightly so. What I'm referring to is the story of the supplying of the F-35 to the UAE. You may remember there was an episode that Biden administration was suspending or reviewing the whole deal. Recently, Biden administration announced that he is going to move forward with the deal. Oh. One of the reasons, not the only one, but one of the reasons was because there was a pressure in the States, because the manufacturers of the F-35 says, this is a huge deal. We are looking at thousands and thousands of jobs of people. You can't just abolish that. And then there is another significant reason for that, and that is the fact that in the end of the day, Biden administration validates, to the best of my understanding, that the alliance of moderation is a positive power that Biden administration should further nurture and support. As of the upcoming or new state joining in, I've been saying it for a long time. Up until now, it was accurate. People said like Saudi Arabia is going to join in. I don't see that happening, not formally, but Saudi Arabia is part of that. You don't have to be part of that formally. You can be also informally. I don't really see in the foreseeable future any other Arab state joining in. In that sense, I must share with you some very interesting short episode. Just as a note, some Arab commentators speculates that, believe it or not, the next Arab state that will consider some sort of like normalization with Israel will be no other than Syria. Yes, I know it's surprising for you. There has been some rumors going around about, you may say, well, what are you talking about? It's interesting. I don't think it's going to happen, but it's interesting to see the mindset. Syria is crumbling. Assad regime is loathed by the Arab world, is outcast by the Arab world, is looking his way back to the Arab world. There is a very complex system in Syria, the United States, the Russians, the Iranians, the Turks, Israel. And basically some Arab commentator says, well, Assad will be willing to consider some sort of deal with Israel, normalization, in return for being back in the arms of the Arab world. Now, just bring that information to your knowledge as something that is being made by Arab commentators. It's not to say that it's accurate, but again, it shows you I think it's interesting because it shows the complexity of the many moving parts of that region. As of now, I don't see the next Arab state jumping into this wagon, but we have to remember that in the end of the day, we are looking at major Arab states that are already in this wagon. We are talking about Egypt, we are talking about United Arab Emirates, we are talking about informally Saudi Arabia. These are the major forces.
I'm going to start apologizing to the people who have been putting questions. I bet this is going to be our last question. The other aspect of the Trump administration was their peace plan. And there are a whole series of questions, like, can you comment on the Palestinian election? If not Abbas, who is a likely successor, can you comment on the basic support of the Biden administration, the basic concepts of the peace plan? And perhaps can you comment on the lack of an ambassador appointment? Is that a clear statement of the administration's policy or lack of concern about Israeli Palestinian progress? So please.
Yeah, well, each and one of those questions, and excellent questions, they all deserve, profound answer. Let me say something shortly about the Palestinian elections. Big question mark. Is it going to take place or not? According to the timeline, in the end of May, meaning about a month from now, there are supposed to be an elections to the Palestinian parliament, the legislative council. The elections are, many people in the Arab world and the Palestinian street are very skeptic whether these elections will take place at all, because they are referring to one significant and very rightly so fact. The Palestinians are split. Fatah and Hamas, the two major Palestinian factors, are totally bitter enemies one to the other, ideologically, politically, practically, you just name it. Palestinians themselves, and rightly so, and many Arab commentators basically says, with elections, without elections, this Palestinian slip is not going to be end. And basically many of the Arab commentators and many Palestinians to a certain extent wish there will be no elections because they are concerned it's going to just deepen the Palestinian crisis. On the other hand, there is a lot of enthusiasm among some circles, including, by the way, many young people, Palestinians, that are now supposed to vote for the first time in their life. The upcoming elections are resulting in split and frictions within Fatah, the major Palestinian factor of the Palestinian Authority. Mahmoud Abbas, the president, is the chairman of the Fatah. This is the tenor of his timeline. It's the twilight of his position. And there is already an ongoing power struggle who is going to be next in power. There are different factors that are mentioned in that sense, different personalities. I can't definitely say who exactly will be the one. It's more likely that it's going to be some sort of like a multi-focused, multi-area powership, new powership that will arise in the Palestinian Authority. Mohammed Dahlan is mentioned, Marwan Barghouti that is imprisoned in the Israeli jail, and others. But it is really, really big question mark. The big question mark is first, whether the elections will take place at all, which to this point, I'm not so sure to say decisively it will. It seems like Abbas was making either a very calculated risk or taking a very risk gamble when he was moving ahead with these elections. By the way, he may use the story of Jerusalemite Palestinians as a ticket to exit the story of the elections and to cancel them. As of now, there is a lot of uncertainty around that issue. But I think that I could say one way or another that the Palestinians, as I said long time ago, with elections, without elections, are experiencing a very deep, complex crisis in many layers. The Palestinian cause has plummeted in the political agenda of the Arab world. And this is one of the major challenges that the Palestinian has to confront. One thing I think I can say for sure regarding Abbas' legacy with elections or without elections, whatever is going to take place, if there is going to be elections or not, the outcome or the ramifications of Abbas' legacy in the Palestinian path are very obscure. The Palestinians have a long path ahead to take, and as far as I can see, it's a very foggy path ahead. I don't know how they're going to navigate their path ahead.
There's a lot of uncertainty everywhere, and we look forward to hearing from you when you come by on your book tour. I doubt very much of all these questions will be answered, but hopefully that we're moving toward a more peaceful environment. Steve.
Thank you, Avi, and thank you, Norm. And thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm Steve Rabb, Chair of the Jewish Community Relations Council, or JCRC, of Greater Hartford, part of the Jewish Federation of Greater Hartford. One of the many objectives of the JCRC is to enhance understanding of Israel, its relationship to its neighbors in the Middle East, and its relationship to the United States. I hope you found today's presentation as informative as I did. It was terrific, it was insightful, and we appreciate both Avi and Norm. If you'd like to see this program again, you'll find a recording on our YouTube channel. Just go to YouTube and enter Jewish Federation of Greater Hartford in the search bar. We'll add today's recording sometime in the next couple of days. Thanks again for attending, and stay well.